action.
Hey everyone, here at the CloudNative Security Conference hosted by the Linux Foundation. We're doing demos here today, and my first guest is Kevin Hoffman, CTO and co-founder at Cosmonic. Hi Kevin, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
You're going to give us a little demo, as I understand.
That's the plan.
We're going to see Cosmonic, and I also want to hear about the advantages of WebAssembly with cloud security.
Okay.
And security overall. We know that WebAssembly allows for isolation and sandboxing. We hear a lot of very traditional techniques being used by vendors in particular to approach security. I would love to hear kind of this alternative view of WebAssembly, but let's take a look at Cosmonic.
Like you said, one of the big benefits of WebAssembly is the sandbox and the isolation. At the file level, the WebAssembly module itself is completely isolated, can't talk to the operating system, can't talk to the host's memory. That's all shared in sandbox. That's all isolated and sandboxed. And that's the file level security. Then there's the runtime level security above that, where you need a runtime to run a WebAssembly module.
Right.
And so whether that's a browser or whether that's like an Edge runtime or WASM Cloud or Cosmonic, those runtimes are responsible for enforcing higher level security. And in the talk that I'm going through tomorrow, in addition to the core WebAssembly security, the open source WASM Cloud project adds another level of security on top of that. And then Cosmonic adds even more security as well as turnkey hosting.
What is do you think the deficiency in this approach that we're seeing, for instance, with Sbombs, for example?
Yeah. There's really two ways to deal with this problem. There's either reactive or proactive, right? And a lot of the tools that we have now, whether it's like the Docker Notary or observability and management, we see when the burglar is in the house.
Yeah.
We get notified when the door opens or the window breaks, but there's nothing we can do really. I mean, there are precautions we can take, but most of the time we're basically sitting back and waiting for someone to break in, and then we catch them in the act.
Right.
And what I like about the potential future that WebAssembly gives us is the fact that a vast majority of the attack vectors are just physically impossible on WebAssembly. So instead of me sitting back and waiting to be told when someone's broken into my house, I'm confident that under most conditions, nobody's going to be able to break into my house anyway.
Excellent. Well, let's go through the Cosmonic demo, and perhaps you can provide some color on how this compares to other solutions.
So for some context, in case people aren't really all that familiar with WebAssembly, what I have on this screen, what I'm wiggling over here, is a WebAssembly module that takes in a web request, adds a number to a counter in a key value store, and then gives me the data back. So it's just a simple, this is like your classic Hello World microservice. The difference is that because this is a WebAssembly module, I have an enormous amount of security built on top of that. So when I click on this thing, you'll see that this WebAssembly module has a public key, which means it's been signed with asymmetric encryption. So I can verify the issuer of every one of these WebAssembly modules. I can verify when it was issued, when the signature expires, all that stuff. But in addition, I can also verify that this thing is allowed to use a web server, and it's allowed to use a key value store. So, you sometimes you have tools at the really low level where, you decide whether or not a microservice can use a particular socket or a particular port.
Yeah.
But at that level, there's really nothing that tells you why it's using that port.
Okay.
Some services need access to TCP ports for benign reasons. And so it's really hard to try, without inspecting the content and all that stuff, trying to block it at that level. So at the WebAssembly runtime level, we control whether or not this thing is allowed to use a web server or whether it's allowed to use a key value store.
Okay.
And one of the other subtle benefits here is because this WebAssembly module can't actually talk to the operating system or make its own socket requests or have any interaction with the real network. It has to go through a you could call it a side effect or a non-functional requirement, but we tend to refer to them as capabilities. So this web server here is not actually part of my deployment product. So in the quote-unquote old way of doing things, if I deploy a microservice, the web server that I use is embedded in it, the database that I use is embedded in it, all of my dependencies are part of that package. It's that phrase where you own your dependencies. Well, in this case, I can actually swap this web server at runtime without my code ever knowing the difference. I can swap in a real database for a test database, or I can change from Redis to Cassandra, all at runtime because of the isolation from the WebAssembly module.
Which you couldn't do in a traditional approaches, but it would require a lot of configuration.
Yeah, so the problem you generally have when you want to support something like that is if you're going to change from one database to another, you have to go into your code, change the client library, and then refactor all of your stuff that used the client library, or you have to build all these bloated anti-corruption layers in the code. But what we don't have to do is change our deployment artifact anymore. And so in addition to like for the log4j vulnerability, right?
Right.
With that, let's say there was a vulnerability in one of these providers.
Right.
Now I can change that in the provider once, and all of my deployed units that are currently running in production will automatically upgrade to the newest capability without me having to recompile, refactor, redesign, or redeploy.
Okay, so is that the foundation for what you offer at Cosmonic?
Yep. So at the bottom level, you've got the core WebAssembly standards, and then above that you have Wasm Cloud, the CNCF open source project,
right,
that enables the ability to build composable distributed applications out of WebAssembly modules.
Right.
And then Cosmonic lets you build them on infrastructure you don't have to manage. And there's some other interesting stuff, but you see how I've got this host here?
Yeah.
This is an abstract concept of a host. It's not actually like a physical thing. It's not an EC2 instance.
Yeah.
It's not a VM. You can't even really say whether it's a firecracker or not. But it's running inside Cosmonic.
Right.
If I had run this other command, Cosmo up, in on my laptop is now a part of Cosmonic's infrastructure, and I don't have to use complex tools like with Kubernetes and telepresence, and I don't have to deal with like VPNs and proxies. I can just stand up compute on my laptop, verify that everything works, move the compute into the cloud, and then shut my laptop down, and it's all set.
The last question I have then is, what's the barrier of entry for people with WebAssembly? What's going to tip it to do you think, for it to really kind of really take off and people see that value that you're talking about?
This may be an interesting opinion, but I think when you're going to see that tipping point is when we no longer have WebAssembly dedicated conferences. WebAssembly will be an implementation detail for security and dev tools and CloudNative, and so it'll be just a checkbox you tick in VS Code or something else.
Okay.
Once it hits that level of ubiquity, then that's where the tipping point's going to be. We're already seeing some of that momentum gathered from companies like Cosmonic and the evolution of some of the applications that you can run in the browser. And so as more people start to realize that WebAssembly is a cloud native tool more than a browser tool, then I think that's where the path is going to go.
Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, no problem. Glad to be here.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.